to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the one threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friend, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Welcome to the University of Illinois Chicago's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Commemoration Week. Today, we will be having a critical conversation with Michelle Alexander. My name is Alexandria Pollard, and I am one of the co-moderators today, along with Dr. Ransby. We come together as a campus to remember and recognize the service and inspiration that MLK offered the world. I would like to introduce UIC Chancellor Michael Emeritus, who has led UIC since March 2015. His responsibilities span far and wide, and he sees UIC as a model for public-urban research across the country. UIC is an institution that has a significant local and worldwide impact with an R1 research status. With more than 33,000 students, 12,000 faculty and staff, and 16 academic colleges, including one of the nation's largest medical schools and Chicago's first and only public law school. The Chancellor, like many of us faculty and staff, students, and community members, have high hopes for what we can achieve in the future as we work towards equity and inclusion together. Now you will hear a video from the Chancellor.
Thank you, Alexandria. It is a privilege to welcome our students, faculty, staff, alumni, and community partners to honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and to participate in the conversation that will follow with Professor Michelle Alexander, but also with activist and writer Michelle Alexander. For the past 6 years, we have hosted speakers annually during our Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Commemoration Week, and we have also included a day of service and a recognition of our MLK scholarship recipients. This year, we will be screening the movie 13th, and our second annual MLK campus-wide book club will be featuring Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, to continue what we learn and hear today. Today's theme, It Starts With Me, Creating a Beloved Community, is critical to advancing our understanding of the current state of affairs in the nation and the world, and to learn ways to make a difference as individuals and as a campus community. We have all witnessed the state of the nation over the past several years and beyond, the horrible effects of racism and the questioning of science and facts during a global pandemic. A pandemic that also exposed one more time the disparities in our country, a pandemic that disproportionately affected the most vulnerable and most disadvantaged among us. As members of one of the most diverse institutions of higher learning, an institution that reflects the changing demographics of our country, UIC students, faculty, staff, and alumni know that the desire and commitment to make a difference are imprinted on UIC's DNA. But it is always important to pause and reflect, to have a conversation, to look at what we know has worked to bring about positive progress, and also to look for what we are missing. What can be done better and more effectively? Where and how are we failing to meet our goals for justice and equity? And in order to make a difference, we must be having some strategic conversations. How can we, the members of our UIC community, propel Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy to significantly and more substantially contribute to social justice for all? I have no doubt that the conversation that will follow will inspire us and help move us forward on a path to fulfill our promise, our potential, and our obligation to be a society in which we can all truly and equally participate. Now I have the pleasure to introduce your co-moderators to guide us through our discussion today, Dr. Barbara Ransby and Alexandria Pollard. Dr. Ransby is the MacArthur Endowed Chair in Liberal Arts and Sciences at UIC, a distinguished professor in the departments of Black Studies, Gender and Women's Studies, and History. Professor Ransby is also the author of 3 books, including the award-winning biography, Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement, and is regularly published in scholarly venues and popular outlets. She is also a fellow of the Society of American Historians, a past president of the National Women's Studies Association, and the editor-in-chief of Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, culture, and society. Dr. Ransby is the executive director of the Social Justice Initiative at UAC, which is currently leading the Social Justice Portal Project, a collaborative think tank created in 2021 to bring together scholars, organizers, artists, and activists to address the urgent questions of racial and social justice. Alexandria Pollard is a third-year law student at the UAC School of Law. She currently serves as the Vice President of UAC Law Student Bar Association, as a graduate assistant in the Law School's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and as a member of the Black Law Student Association. Alexandria is also an associate board member of Legal Prep Charter Academy. She graduated from the Emory and Henry College with a bachelor's degree in sociology, crime, and society, and then spent a year working for AmeriCorps College Possible program here in Chicago. Alexandria has already accepted a position to work at Chapman and Calter LLP following her graduation from our law school. Thank you both, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Chancellor Emeritus, for that lovely introduction and to all that you have done in your leadership for the UIC around the question of racial and social justice. So it is my pleasure in just a moment to introduce our special guest, Michelle Alexander. But before I do that, I want to welcome and acknowledge Emily Jane Steinberg. Emily is a part of our program today in a very special way. She is a public listener. We need more of those. She is a visual facilitator and scribe who works across all sectors and subject matters. And so throughout this program, she will provide a visualization to our critical conversation with Michelle Alexander. The final piece will be provided digitally to each of our participants. So we are going to engage with Michelle Alexander in multiple media. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce this year's UIC Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speaker and my friend, Michelle Alexander. We wish you could be with us here in person, but we are excited to have you with us virtually, perhaps together in person soon. Michelle is the New York Times bestselling author of The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And this book has had an enormous reach, an enormous impact. Michelle has brought profound insights on the practice of mass incarceration that plagues the US justice system, as well as has been a part of eye-opening conversations about racial caste in America. In The New Jim Crow, Michelle peels back the curtain on systemic racism in the American prison system, which a New York Times review of books describes as striking in her intelligence, her power of summary, and the force of her writing. With equal force and candor, she has been a part of numerous conversations around the country, breaking the silence about racial injustice in the modern legal system and in the country, and a part of a larger chorus of voices that are speaking out around issues of police violence, prisons, and carcerality. Michelle is a legal scholar, a social justice advocate, and a columnist at the New York Times. We are so glad you are there, and visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary. Her work explores the myths surrounding our criminal justice system from a racial and ethical standpoint, and offers solutions for meaningful and transformative change. I really am thrilled to have this conversation with you today, and I want to extend a heartfelt welcome to Michelle Alexander. My co-moderator, Alexandria, is going to start us off with the first question. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
Yes, welcome. We are so excited to have this important conversation today. For the first question I have, Dr. King and his wife, Coretta Scott King, are examples of resilience in America, fighting for the rights of others. What can our participants listening and viewing today take with them to carry on their legacies? How have they impacted your work?
Well, I guess I should begin by first thanking you all for inviting me to join in this commemoration of Dr. King, but also by acknowledging that there was a time when I thought that Dr. King didn't have much to offer me. I, in my younger years, viewed him as an integrationist who was too eager to extend love, forgiveness, and generosity, and was not as militant or radical as I imagined myself becoming. But it wasn't until I stopped paying so much attention to what was being said about King and kind of the selective quoting of King out of context and the sanitized history that was being shared through the media and many classrooms and through popular culture, and started paying far more attention to what King actually said and did in his lifetime, started reading his own words, that I started to see that he was a revolutionary, someone who started off trying to overturn a racial caste system and wound up at the end of his life, thanks in large part to young activists and organizers and movement leaders who are challenging him in important ways, wound up by the end of his life coming to see that actually the entire economic and political system in this country had to change and to be reimagined. That's not to say, of course, that King or was some kind of saint, that he was perfect. Of course, he wasn't. And when we study the history, I think we see that he was subject to enormous criticism, both within the movements of which he was a part, as well as outside of them, sometimes for good reason. But what I find most inspiring about King today is his courage and his capacity for growth, for evolution. He listened to those who were challenging him and questioning it. And he was open to learning more and to growing and to stretching and trying to rise to the challenges of our time. This event opened with the iconic video of the I Have a Dream speech. But who King was in 1963, 1965, wasn't the same person in many ways as the man who was murdered in 1968. In terms of his courage, I think in many ways, it's undeniable and questionable whether or not you embrace a nonviolence as a philosophy or strategy. I think it has to be acknowledged that it's a path that requires extraordinary courage. I find it bizarre now that I ever thought of nonviolence in any way as being weak or conciliatory, when few things require more courage than facing a racist, violent mob unarmed. King believed that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, and he was willing to put his body, his life on the line in an effort to co-create a nation and a world that was rooted in love and respect for one another, rather than in violence and in control. But I think he also demonstrated the courage to evolve, to admit that you're wrong or that you have something to learn. And I think that's an aspect of King's life that I have, strived over and over again to lean towards and to emulate as much as I can. In the beginning, in the introduction of my book, I acknowledged that there was a time that I dismissed out of hand the idea that something like a racial caste system might be alive and well in this country. And, because I was challenged and I was willing to learn and to grow and to admit that I was wrong, I came to see things very, very differently. And I now see things differently than the day that I published The New Jim Crow. I have been challenged in important ways. And in the same way that at the end of King's life, he began to connect the dots between militarism and capitalism and racism, and the necessity of connecting these dots in our analysis and our movements. I've been challenged and been challenging myself to connect those dots in my work and in my own activism. And so I guess I would say that, for me, what Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta King, really have inspired me to do is to think as well as act with as much courage, as I can muster, and to connect more dots rather than imagining that all we need to do is to integrate our current systems, populate them with more people of color, in high places in order to achieve the dream that Dr. King articulated in that speech, and it's an evolving dream, one I hope is growing deeper and broader and more beautiful with time.
Thank you for that. I always appreciate your candor and eloquence in these conversations. When you were talking about how your views of King have evolved, Clay Carson once said, Clay Carson, who was the director of the King Papers Project at Stanford, he said, "King gets wiser as I get older." So it very much reminded me of that. And of course, my work for many years on Ella Baker was a work of kind of critical engagement with King, because she was one of the few people who would say, "Hey, you're
Yes.
wrong about that. We need to do this and not that." She wasn't intimidated. And that created a kind of, I think, a beautiful critical tension between them, and they both learned and grew from it. I wanted to shift and ask you, I'm tempted to ask you how you think your ideas have changed since the book. And so if you want to weave that into the answer, please do. And I've listened to some of your more recent interviews, so I have a clue. But I wanted to ask you about something that's very relevant today as we speak, which is voting rights. That is one arena of struggle, the electoral arena. Right now, voting rights are under attack all across the country, voter suppression, and a really relentless effort to roll back. Now, we know we don't, in some simplistic way, vote our way to freedom, but that is one, forward motion, one victory that came out of the movement of the 50s and 60s is an expansion of voting rights. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the importance of that struggle today.
Well, I think it's critically important. And, I think we now see the writing on the wall more clearly today than we did even 5-10 years ago. We are now headed in back to an era that we, don't want to return to, a place we've been before. The playbook is exactly the same. During the Jim Crow era, there were literacy tests and poll taxes that were on their surface race neutral, but were clearly designed to suppress or eliminate the Black vote. Many people I found forget that during the Jim Crow era, formally race neutral, voter suppression tactics were common. It wasn't that there were laws on the books back then saying Black people are not allowed to vote. Those laws were rendered unconstitutional by the 15th Amendment. During the Jim Crow era, there were formally race neutral tactics that were used to prevent Black people from voting in this country. And those same kinds of tactics are being used with some real success today, yet again. And it's somewhat fascinating to me that mainstream politicians are now suddenly saying quite openly that the tactics that are being employed are reminiscent of the Jim Crow era. I don't think they would be talking that way today if it hadn't been for the uprisings and the movements that have grown in recent years, kind of forcing this conversation about the relevance of our racial history to our present. One could argue that today, those connections are just so obvious that it's undeniable. But I think it should have been equally obvious that the clock was being turned back when Democratic and Republican politicians were competing with each other to be, tougher on crime by passing laws that were disenfranchising African Americans and denying them access to education and access to basic public benefits and on and on. So, I think for Black people, the Black community, the slow collapse of the dream of democracy began a long time ago. It didn't begin with Trump. As the late Lani Guinier, pointed out, Black people have long been the miner's canary. As with the rise of mass incarceration, as millions of poor people, overwhelmingly poor folks of color, were snatched off the streets and out of their homes in the war on drugs and in the Get Tough movement, and stripped of basic voting rights, denied access to education and public benefits. Democracy was dying. The dream of democracy was dying in those communities. And it is only now that this threat of the loss of democracy is impacting and looming so large now for white communities as well, that there's this kind of alarm being sounded that our democracy is in crisis, But of course, democracy has been in crisis for Black communities, not just for a very long time, but since the founding of our country. So as we think about the importance of protecting the vote, not just for Black communities, but for our democracy as a whole, I think it's very important that we keep in mind that our current crisis was not created just by Trump or by Trump supporters. And I say this not to just wag fingers at people like President Biden, who have championed the very policies that led to so much disenfranchisement of Black communities, but instead to say that we're deluding ourselves if we talk and act as though saving our democracy requires merely defeating the Trumps of the world. Like we were talking earlier, near the end of his life, King demonstrated extraordinary moral courage by connecting dots between capitalism and militarism and poverty and racism, and arguing that connecting those dots and restructuring our society was necessary, not just for the liberation of Black people, but to save our democracy. And he was willing to call out, a Democratic president and allies of the civil rights movement, by coming out against the Vietnam War and by, making clear that our fates are, inextricably linked and bound. And so I think the question for us now is not simply what's necessary to restore the vote, what laws need to be passed and whatnot, which is an important conversation to have. But I think there's also the question of what kind of courage is necessary now, what kinds of truths must be told. And are we going to tell the truth about how we got here in a way that helps to ensure not only that we prevent the collapse of our so-called democracy, but that we ensure that we build a real democracy that allows the voices of all people, including those who are currently in cages and locked up and locked out, to truly be heard and to count.
Yeah. No, I think that thing about the thing you said about building a democracy. I mean, that's what I think the 1619 Project is provoking a lot of people to think more broadly. And I'm glad that you invoked Lani, who was very dear to me. With Tyranny of the Majority was a challenge to think of democracy differently, her book. It was a challenge to think of a more robust democracy than we've ever had in this country. And so it's not just hanging on to something that's been precious and pure, but building something that truly can be radically inclusive.
Yes.
I think Alexandria has another question for you.
Yes, I do. Still, within the bounds of our democracy, One of our other machines is basically the criminal justice system and how we see cases played out in the media, specifically George Floyd's case. And then we have Ahmaud Arbery's case. And then we had a huge media attention with Kyle Rittenhouse's case. And we see different outcomes with different cases. And I wanted you to touch on how do we reconcile these different outcomes and whether or not you see that these different outcomes reflect progress being made within our system.
Well, I guess the short answer is no. I don't see these, these verdicts as reflecting progress. I mean, the fact that in the wake of the largest racial justice protests in world history, a white cop and a couple of vigilantes were convicted of killing unarmed, defenseless Black men, murders caught on video. If that's what it takes, it can hardly be viewed as progress. But more importantly, I think we need to be asking, how do we define progress? Is sending brutal cops and racist vigilantes to prison the goal? Is that how we're measuring progress? How do we measure progress? Progress towards racial justice. And we could measure it in all kinds of ways. The number of Black people who are CEOs or leading Fortune 500 companies, the number of Black and brown politicians or presidents, the number of Black or brown people with 2-car garages or SUVs. We can measure progress in purely materialistic terms. Do we have as much stuff as we think we should? Stuff like cars and money, degrees, titles. Measuring progress in this way, I think, makes sense in a capitalist society where the goal is to compete to get more stuff. There's winners and losers, and everyone says they want to get ahead. But I think that when we talk about progress towards racial justice, we have to pause and say, get ahead of whom? And what will happen to them, those who are left behind? For centuries, there's been another way to measure progress that's been offered by philosophers and theologians. Many have said that in any society, any civilization must be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members, including those in prison. I think Dr. King would agree with that assessment. So when measuring progress, it's important not to look up to the top of the pyramid to people like Barack Obama for evidence of that progress, but instead down and ask ourselves, how do we treat the most vulnerable? And this is where I think, one of the greatest contributions of the prison and police abolition movements have been made. Abolition has forced an important debate about the goal. The goal in our racial justice movements and strivings. We can't really measure progress until we agree on a goal. And is the ultimate goal having more racist cops in prison? Is it goal of having equal numbers of people of color in positions of power, reducing the number of Black people killed by the police, equalizing the number of Black and white people killed by police? What does justice mean? And, the abolition movement has kind of dared us to imagine that the goal is living in a world without prisons and police, a world in which the resources that are used to invest in police and prisons and the control of the poorest and the most vulnerable are instead redirected to their well-being, to their thriving, to education, to healthcare, that such a world is possible. And in many ways, I think this is the core message of Dr. King's Beyond Vietnam speech that he delivered, at Riverside Church when he came out against the Vietnam War and, delivered what may have been then his most unpopular speech ever, where he, basically argued that we cannot invest in militarism and wars that are targeting, poor people of color halfway around the world. We need to view those people as worthy of our care and concern as our own citizens, and we need to redirect the money that is being spent bombing and pillaging people in Vietnam to the well-being of folks at home. And that is, kind of what the abolition movement is daring us to dream as well. And many people pilloried, King at the time, saying he was unreasonable and that this was pie in the sky and that he was alienating allies and that he had no business talking about ending wars as a civil rights leader and activist. And yet it seems to me that he was urging us to dream bigger beyond simply integrating institutions, but to imagine a world without militarism, a world in which brown and Black lives truly mattered, and that a world in which we'd be committed to investing in communities and in education and well-being rather than in violence and in control.
Thank you for that answer. Today, I think I saw in a lot of June 2020, there was a lot of talk about abolition and also getting rid of the prisons, but people saying, well, what are we going to do? And this was kind of a really good conversation into being like thinking there are alternate ways of justice and things you can do. Dr. Ransby has another question for you as well.
Yeah, I'm going to jump ahead. We sort of had a script of questions, but I think this invites me to skip ahead to a question I was going to ask a little bit later. But I also want to punctuate the conversation by mentioning, our colleague here at UIC, Beth Ritchie, who is a great, abolitionist thinker and writer. And she has a new book out that I was just reading over last weekend, Abolition, Feminism Now, which weaves together many of the kind of different fragments of justice movements and unjust systems that challenges us to think that abolition is not just about dismantling, but it's about building, and it's about creating a world where prisons are indeed obsolete, to quote Angela Davis's book title. And that's really what it's about. And people try to caricature the abolition movement as something, more simple than it is and one-dimensional than it is, and so forth. But it really is a provocation to do what King and many others, were doing in their time. The question I want to ask you, though, and you've alluded to the April 4th Riverside Church Beyond Vietnam speech, and of course there's the I've Been to the Mountaintop speech, both of which illustrate the kind of radical King, this larger holistic vision. And at one point, King calls for a radical restructuring of society. He indicts capitalism as well as militarism and racism. And you've talked not just about race and racial justice in a narrow sense, but racial justice embedded in a larger struggle around economic justice. Because of course, the people who are in prisons are not college professors and doctors and lawyers for the most part, right? They are people who are also economically vulnerable as well as racially marked. So, what about that radical restructuring? There was, as you said, many people in the street around the George Floyd murder. There were many people involved in electoral politics the last electoral season than were in the past in many different ways. We had a socialist candidate running for the Democratic nomination and a lot of things in motion. What are some of your thoughts about the possibilities for that kind of radical change while we see this right-wing movement growing at the same time?
Well, I am hopeful that the kind of bold, creative, radical thinking that is emerging from so many of the movements that have grown, and many of which have been born since Ferguson and the uprisings after George Floyd's killing, are going to help inspire a rethinking of how we allocate resources, what our budgets look like, how our schools are designed, in every area of our political, economic, and social life. I think King was right. We have to think in terms of a radical restructuring, a radical imagination. And, I think, Barbara, we've talked briefly before about my own interest now in the relationship between climate change and racial justice organizing and activism. And, it is not just that we are facing the potential collapse of our democracy, such as it is. We are also facing the collapse of our climate and what makes life sustainable on this planet. And it is not far off potentiality for many people who are alive today, particularly young people who are alive today. The kinds of changes, climate changes that are on the horizon are going to, if we do not have a radical shift in direction, have enormous impact in their lives, their lifetimes. And I'm talking about what will likely result not only just in terms of like storms and fires and the kinds of things that are often publicized as climate related, but also things like mass migration, the kinds of droughts that leave communities stranded without water. I often recommend the book The Uninhabitable Earth for people who don't understand what it means for our climate to warm by 3 degrees rather than 2 degrees in a very short period of time. And I say this is related to racial justice because, as Lonnie Guinier pointed out, Black communities, communities of color, are often the miner's canary, the ones that get hit hardest and first.
Yep.
And if we do not reimagine green economies that do justice to all communities, including especially poor communities and communities of color, we will not survive for generations to come as a people on this planet. And so I think this radical restructuring is necessary in thinking of what kind of energy are we going to use and who is going to be involved in creating these new energy sources. How are we going to feed ourselves? What are our sustainable living practices, gardening practices, urban gardening, et cetera? What does a fair and just economic model look like as our climate evolves and changes? And are Black people going to be left to kind of fend for themselves? Or are we going to get ahead of this in a way and seize this opportunity to reimagine what our communities and our economy can look like? I want to use marijuana legalization as kind of an odd example of the difference between making a legal change that appears to be useful for promoting racial justice and reimagining what justice means and what a fair economic model might be. I support marijuana legalization because rounding up young people of color for relatively minor nonviolent drug offenses has been a primary tool for sweeping people into the system and getting them branded at young ages and relegated to a permanent second-class status. So I support marijuana legalization. But it is not enough to simply legalize marijuana and allow people who already have wealth and resources to step in and to create big businesses and corporations that are now profiting, billion-dollar corporations profiting from the sale and distribution of marijuana, while poor people and people of color are left out and still locked up in many cases. No, instead, marijuana legalization could have created an opportunity to reimagine what justice looks like. And in some cases, people are doing that. What does it mean to create a fair and just market for something like marijuana? Is it even possible within a capitalist system? What does it look like to pay reparations? What does restorative justice look like in the context of marijuana legalization? Well, the same is true today in virtually every aspect where we're talking about education, where we're talking about climate change. It's not a matter of simply changing rules. What's required is tremendous imagination and courage to ask ourselves, what would a fair and just education system look like, and what is required in these times as we face challenges to our democracy, as our earth begins to warm? What do our young people need to learn? What do they need to know? What skills do they need to develop to organize to be self-sufficient, to know how to collaborate and to be interdependent. What do we need to know? What do we need to teach our young people? So I'm grateful that so many of these conversations are opening up, and there are so many new experiments in recent years with new forms of movement building and new economic models, not the least of which are driven in part by concerns about climate change.
Just a footnote to that wonderful answer. I'm reminded of Bill McKibben's quote about capitalism and climate change is like we have an infinite growth economic system on a finite planet, and that's
Yes.
a wall that you cannot get over or get around. Absolutely. Alexandria, you want to?
Yes, I would love. Yes, I would love to pose this question towards restorative justice. You mentioned it in your preface in the 10th anniversary edition of your book, how restorative justice models, they help break the harm that perpetuates communities. And can you talk about the importance of these alternative means? Because at the law school here, we have great restorative justice classes taught by Judge Murphy and Professor Sang that really teach the lawyers now that there are different means of justice and not just the current model is the most effective. So can you touch on that piece a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's a development that's so exciting that there's this proliferation now of restorative justice programs, experimentation practices all over the country. I think it's important that we acknowledge that many of these practices and programs have their roots in indigenous traditions. That there is we owe a certain debt to many indigenous traditions that had a very different model of resolving conflict and approaching justice questions. And in so many ways, whether it's, when it comes to justice or how we treat the environment, I think we're beginning, as a culture, to appreciate the wisdom of indigenous communities that were decimated in order to make way for this nation. But one of the important contributions to restorative justice in recent years is helping people to see that violence doesn't have to be met with violence, that there are alternative ways to respond to violence in our communities. And restorative justice approaches also recognize, I think, that our prison system, our system of prison and policing, is a system of violence. And we need to ask ourselves whether responding to any form of harm, whether it's, quote unquote, non-violent crime, or one that's categorized as a violent crime with more violence, which is likely trauma-inducing for the person who experiences it, is likely to prevent more harm or create more harm for the individuals involved. You may be familiar with Common Justice that was created by Daniel Surratt and others in New York City. And one of the most important findings, not only in her research, but also in the work of Common Justice, is that, contrary to popular belief, people who are victims, survivors of violence, don't necessarily want a violent response to the harm that they've endured or survived. So, the Common Justice Program offers survivors of violence in New York City, Brooklyn, an option. You can choose either to pursue incarceration for the person who has caused you harm, take the traditional path, the road most traveled, or as a survivor, you can choose a restorative justice process in which you have the opportunity to confront the person who has given you harm, speak your truth, share the pain, and participate in a process of devising what it would mean for that person to try to repair the harm that they've caused. And to their surprise, in early years, something like 90% of people who were given the option whether to pursue incarceration or pursue a restorative justice chose the restorative justice process. That surprises a lot of people, but when you think about it, for people who are survivors, they don't get a whole lot out of the traditional punitive approach. It's not designed for their benefit. It's not designed for their healing. It's not designed to restore them or to repair the harm that they've caused. Our system revolves around, the intentional infliction of harm and suffering on someone who's caused harm and suffering. And so through programs like Common Justice, they found that actually it is possible, even when dealing with violent offenses, violent crimes, to design alternative ways of responding that better meet the needs of the person who is harmed, and also help to ensure that the person who has caused harm is truly held accountable. And accountability doesn't mean just sitting in a cage. Accountability means coming to terms with the harm that they've caused and doing what is possible to try to repair that harm. And so, my hope is that we will, in the months and years to come, shift away from merely the kinds of reforms that are designed to just, reduce the numbers of people in cages, to interventions and programs and, the building of alternatives to kind of what we call justice today. And kind of reimagine what it actually looks like for our communities to respond to and heal trauma. It's often said that hurt people hurt people. And on one level, kind of everybody nods and gets that that's true. And yet we perpetuate systems that are rooted in the intentional infliction of suffering and harm on people who have suffered trauma and harm, and think that somehow that we are going to solve the problem of violence in doing so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As you're speaking, I'm thinking of the restorative justice model as it fits within a transformative justice agenda too, right? Because on an individual level, one person causes harm to the other. And, you're so right. The only thing the system seems to offer people as some modicum of justice is revenge, right? To hurt and to cage someone as some way to comfort you if you have lost something or someone. But what has to also change in addition to those how we negotiate those individual instances is a larger set of structures, right? The people have to have jobs and housing and all of the things that education and all the things that make it less likely we will harm ourselves and others.
Absolutely. And I also want to add too, that reminds me, that's an excellent point. It reminds me too that restorative justice, there isn't a cookie cutter model that can work in every situation. And restorative justice also requires taking into account real power imbalances that sometimes exist between the perpetrators and those who have suffered harm.
Right.
And when you talk about harm that is done between, for example, a police officer who has shot someone and maybe wounded them or maimed them, to talk about restorative justice in that context is a very different thing than talking about restorative justice in the context of kids who are in a fight on a schoolyard, or even between, gang members. That the political, social, economic context in which the harm occurs and the power differentials that exist are things that have to be taken very seriously. And it's not simply a matter of just getting folks in a room to work out, a nice solution. It's much more complicated than that, but also much more promising than that as well.
So the last question I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to turn it over to Alexandria to acknowledge our visual artist. is really, hopefully a lot of our students are watching this program, and I know that you speak to a lot of activists around the country when you're speaking, and I know you're in a very contemplative place now of, sorting out, answers for yourself and bigger picture. So I don't want to ask you for all the answers, but in terms of solutions, in terms of how young people can get involved, what kind of advice you might offer. And I'll just say, for my thoughts, I've been so impressed as someone who's been an activist for many years, with this generation of activists, young feminists in particular, who have a very holistic approach to the change they want to make in the world, and who see it as a process of changing oneself as well as changing the world, linking LGBTQ issues with issues of incarceration and the carceral state, and economic justice and climate, and really, not making it a laundry list, but making it a part of a single project. And that really gives me hope. So what, organizations, campaigns, struggles, pathways to activism are giving you hope in this moment?
Yeah, there are so many extraordinary organizations that have grown and have emerged in recent years. It's difficult to say, oh, here's my favorite of them all.
Yeah.
But I would offer maybe two examples that are very different from one another. One is the Dream Defenders,
Love them.
which I really have loved for years now. And in many ways,
They're
I
very
think
lovable.
yes, they are. And I think the Dream Defenders in many ways kind of illustrates this principle of growth and evolution over time that you're talking about earlier, about how King grew and evolved and learned as the movement changed and evolved. And with the Dream Defenders, an organization founded by young people outraged after Trayvon Martin's killing, and were determined to challenge the stand the ground laws in Florida that helped to make events like Trayvon's killing possible. Beginning there, I won't say that's a narrow focus or a small task, but beginning there, focusing on kind of that police and vigilante violence, racist violence, and then beginning over time to see the connections between the organizing against George Zimmerman and stand the ground laws, and the organizing that was necessary to challenge racist police violence, and the organizing that's necessary to challenge the larger system of mass incarceration, and the links to mass deportation, and the relationship between mass incarceration and mass deportation in the United States and the plight of Palestinians, half a world away. And to connect the dots between these things, and to build movements, and to commit themselves to political education and deepening their own understanding, not instead of, but in addition to doing the work of organizing on the ground and learning and evolving as they grow. And so, I see the Dream Defenders as a very promising model that I expect will grow further, and continue to flourish over time. I would also, I think, lift up a new way of life, which was founded, an organization founded by a friend of mine, Susan Burton, formerly incarcerated woman who, when she was released from prison, decided to dedicate her life to ensuring that no other woman would ever have to go through what she went through. When she was released, she was unable to find a job, unable even to get, food stamps to get food for her own survival, and was back out on the street over and over again, back into prison, unable to get help for her drug addiction. And so when she was released from prison and finally got clean, she decided she wanted to commit the rest of her life to ensuring no other woman would have to go through what she went through, and opened first her own home to women returning home from prison, meeting women as they're coming off the prison bus in downtown LA with nothing but a cardboard box of their belongings, and saying, come home with me, sleep on my couch, sleep on my floor. You don't have to turn to the streets tonight. And who now runs 5 safe homes for women in Los Angeles and is developing a network of safe homes for formerly incarcerated women all over the country. And, I see the work of a new way of life and, an organization like the Dream Defenders to be, very different, but equally important models of what's required in these times. I think a lot of times people think what it means to join the movement is to get out in the streets and get your sign together, and absolutely protest in the streets is necessary. And absolutely, we need young people forming and joining organizations like Dream Defenders. But we also need people who are providing care and support to those who are being treated as disposable right now, today, and finding organizations and people who are providing pathways to survival and to thriving. And, I say to young people, figure out what makes you come alive, what you're most passionate about. Are you an artist? Do you love to paint? Well, then how can you use your art in a way that is in service of the movement? If you are someone who aspires to be a doctor, well, then in what way can you ensure that whatever skills you have, talents you have, interests you have, in what way can you, as a doctor, use your skills, talents, knowledge to serve the movement? If you want to be a teacher, whatever it is, there are ways for each and every one of us to use our skills, talents, gifts, interests, passions in service of the movement in countless forms of organizations and contributions that are necessary now and will continue to be, for the foreseeable future.
Thank you for that. If I could just say one thing, I'm reminded around the time of King's Holiday, the thing he said about moral courage and taking positions that are difficult. And in that context, yes. I want to thank you for the op-ed you did on Palestinian rights in the New York Times, because I know you caught flack for that, and it was a very important and principled intervention. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for keying the audience into those two organizations. We now invite the audience to post questions in the YouTube chat. We'll take about 1 to 2 questions, but we also wanted to check in with Emily Jane while people are posing the questions. We're excited to see your visualization of this conversation, Emily. Wow, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Radical imagination.
Thank you. Love that. Yes.
Wow. Thank you, Emily. And before we continue with the questions from the audience, we'd also like to recognize and congratulate the 2021-2022 Dr. Martin Luther King Scholarship recipients. The Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Scholarship Program was established in 1985 at UIC to recognize underrepresented students who have demonstrated high academic achievement and have shown a commitment to civil rights and social justice through community service. In an effort to keep Dr. Martin Luther King's dreams alive, these awards are given to undergraduate, graduate, and professional students. Congratulations to all the students that have been displayed on the screen.
Congratulations. Congratulations. I think we're waiting to see if there are any audience questions. We have covered a lot of territory in this conversation, and Alexandria and I were trying to discipline ourselves. So
yes,
not ask more questions so that audience would have a chance. You want to ask the first one, Alexandria?
Yes. The first question it says, could you please share a bit about the role of religion and faith at your work at the union? What roles does religion and people of faith have in radical reconstructuring?
That's a great question. And, I myself don't consider, I'm not a member of any particular religion. I don't identify as Christian. And yeah, I'm not a member of any other religion or faith tradition. However, I kind of came to see in my own life and in the work that I was a part that any effort to address the problems, the crises that we face as though they are purely, legal or policy problems to be solved, that don't have a deeper moral, spiritual, personal dimension, I think is doomed to fail. We aren't just widgets. We're not commodities. And the movements that have been built over time have required enormous courage. I would say drawing on a power and a source of love greater than us. And I think we owe it to ourselves, or at least I owed it to myself, to take more seriously what our faith traditions have to teach us about what it means to rise to the challenges of our time. What kind of courage, what kind of faith, and faith in what and in whom is necessary in these times. And, what's interesting to me is that so many of our faith traditions, ancient faith traditions, have so much in common in terms of core moral, ethical teachings. And there are resources available to us in these faith traditions, stories, teachings, practices, rituals, and faith traditions from all over the world, where people have faced extraordinary challenges to their very survival, who have faced the challenges of empire. The Bible itself is the story of rise and fall of empire, and stories that attempt to explain what's necessary for true human liberation. The speech that King gave at the opening, he kept returning to the kind of theme of faith and the faith that is required in order for us to do what's necessary to achieve the dream. And he may have had faith in, a particular kind of Christian faith in a particular, in Jesus in a particular way that helped to animate his commitment to the struggle. But what's interesting to me is that across faith traditions, there is faith that another world is possible. And that if we live in right relationship with each other and adopt certain moral practices and ethical principles, we can learn to live together differently as human beings. And I'm interested in learning from indigenous traditions, from faith traditions around the world about what it means to live in right relationship with one another. And that is a profound moral question. It's a spiritual question. It's a personal question. And I think it's a question that we as a nation and really as a planet have to wrestle with in these times.
That might lead us to, this might be the final question. I think we have some timekeepers. I'm not good at that because I will get into the conversation and we'll be off air. But one of the audience members asked the question about alternatives to traditional policing. And that's a big challenge for a lot of people to imagine. You invited us into radical imagining. How would you respond to that, or how do you think we should respond to that? I mean, obviously, prevention of intervening to prevent situations from occurring where police will be called to intervene, and then, of course, what I've learned from people like Mariam Kaba and others is de-escalation of situations, which many police are not trained to do, and their presence often intensifies and escalates situations rather than de-escalating the situations. But do you have any thoughts about alternatives to traditional policing?
Well, I actually think that the alternatives to thinking about alternatives to traditional policing has to begin with thinking about what it means to prevent certain kinds of harm from occurring in the first place. And so I guess that's what you mean by prevention. And, I think it's very difficult in the context of a society in which people are struggling for survival, are shamed and stigmatized and demonized if they've ever been branded a criminal or a felon, and who fear the prospect of prison, and who don't have adequate education possibilities, job possibilities, the rest. It's very difficult when people are desperate, fearful, struggling for survival, have no sense of safety net, to then have a conversation about, oh, what does it mean to devise an entirely different system, that would serve the same function as the police, but not be police. It ends up being kind of almost like a nonsensical question and puzzle. I absolutely agree with Miriam Kaba that, thinking, about de-escalation and how do we respond to harm and to conflict in ways that de-escalate rather than escalate? How do we respond to harm that creates less harm and less trauma and less fear rather than creating more harm and more trauma, more fear? Absolutely. This should be kind of common sense. And for many of us, it is already common sense in our families or communities in which we were a part, where some kind of harm is committed or conflict arises, and behavior happens that is technically illegal, but the first thing we do is not call the police. We seek naturally other ways because we care about the people who are involved. And so asking the question, how would we respond if we actually cared about the person who has caused the harm as well as the person who has suffered the harm, is an important question. But, in many communities, traditional policing, and by that I mean the stopping and frisking and searching and constant surveillance of people, and then a purely punitive response when harm occurs, isn't the norm. And so, this idea that is it possible to have communities where there isn't constant surveilling and brutal policing is embedded in the, framework of the community? Of course it is possible. And it is possible in those places because there are already so many alternatives. Mental health care is readily available. Education opportunities are readily available. Jobs are plentiful. Therapy is available. Legal drugs are available. The role of legal drugs in so many communities with antidepressants and, medication that's meant to help people cope with trauma is actually very important in preventing conflicts that might otherwise escalate. And so, when I think of alternatives to policing, I think about healthcare, mental health care, education, job creation, the availability of supports that make the kinds of conflicts that would require the intervention of something like a police system unnecessary. And then once we've created that, the kinds of questions about alternatives to policing will seem much less hard to us. But that's not to say that we have to wait until all of those things have been accomplished before we begin to think of alternatives to policing. Already in so many communities, there are, organizations that have committed themselves to de-escalating conflicts, going out into communities, standing on corners, talking to gang members, to prevent conflicts from happening in the first place and to respond in some way without sending people just into the system and involving police to resolve those conflicts. So there are numerous organizations that are already committed to those experiments. And I think it's really just common sense that if we invest in the thriving of communities, that we are going to see far less conflicts and harm that would require intervention in the first place.
Equity and Transformation is a group here in Chicago doing some of that, that work on the West Side. Alexandria, you're going to close us out.
Yes, I was just going to say thank you so much, Michelle Alexander and Dr. Ransby, for spending the afternoon with us. I think that this was an invaluable conversation and definitely a great way to carry on the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. And really got me fired up just for everything that I have going on and graduating and getting into the legal market and starting my career. I'm excited to do the good work. And also a special thanks to the MLK Planning Committee, Creative Digital Services, ASL, and closed captioning interpreters. Dr. Ransby, I didn't know if you had any information that you'd like to share about the Social Justice Initiative. If you would.
Just to say, we have a social justice initiative here at UIC. Michelle knows about it. We have a project called the Portal Project, which is borrowed from a quote from the writer Arundhati Roy about pandemic as portal, as the opportunity to think about transformation and not just perpetual crisis. And we have artists, activists, and scholars engaged in 2 years of conversation, debate, and writing about those issues. So check us out.
Thank you for sharing. And to everybody in the audience, there will be a follow-up email with a link for viewing the program. And you'll also receive information about our MLK Day Book Club, MLK Challenge 2020, and the screening of the movie 13th, UIC's Black History Month, and Winter Involvement Fair. So we have a lot of new things coming up, so please check out your email. And then UIC will also continue these conversations in our programs for Black History Month. Thank you, everyone, and have a safe and good evening. Until next time.
And thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.